I watched the end of it. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third of our Mission and Justice series on Native American people in the U.S. My name is Jim Holden. I'm a member of the Mission and Justice Committee, and I want to start out by saying thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to the other two sessions if you have done so. The first featured Kelly Sherman Conroy, who is Native American, who spoke about her own personal experiences living in the U.S. as a Native American person, and she's actually a minister, Lutheran pastor. And last week we had Josh Spitzak from the middle school who talked about the course that they're teaching at the middle school on Native Americans. Now, next week, we haven't yet decided what we're going to do, but we may have a follow-up session, discussion perhaps, maybe a movie, who knows? We haven't decided yet, but we encourage you to consider that as another option for you next Sunday. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Steve Hahn from St. Olaf College. Steve is a native of Michigan. He's very happy today because the University of Michigan won in the last minute in a football game. And the Gophers, of course, lost, so we're in mourning, and they should not have lost. Steve teaches in the history department. His specialties are colonial history, colonial American history, Native American history, and Atlantic world history. He's also written 2 books and is working on a third, which struck me as interesting because I just went to see the Pirates of Penzance last week at the Gilbert and Sullivan Very Light Opera Company. It's called The Pirates of Providence, which I thought was a good title. But he's also written a book called The Invention of the Creek Nation and the Life and Times of Mary Musgrove, who is a part Creek Indian woman who was a character who lived in the 18th century. His interests also extend to piracy in the Caribbean, and that's hence the book that he's writing about that topic. He says that, and his wife Mary is here today. Thank you for coming. And they have 2 children, right? I don't know how old they are, but they're Aaron and Luke. And he has his own, by his own definition, a certified golf addict. And you're interested in football as well, you said, and hockey. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Steve Hahn, and he's going to talk today about the topic of the Trail of Tears. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for that introduction, Jim. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a cold Sunday morning. So really appreciate to have an audience. Kind of nice talking to adults. I'm used to 20-year-olds, so this is kind of nice. The Trail of Tears. I kind of got into this by way of my own research. The Muskogee Creek tribe currently of Oklahoma, formerly of Georgia and Alabama, is the main focus of my research, at least the first half of my career. And I was just sort of struck by a need for courses in Native American history at St. Olaf. That was one of the reasons I was hired, was to teach that subject. And the Trail of Tears was kind of a culmination of a lot of years of research and reflection. So I teach a course. I'm teaching it right now on this subject. It's kind of an interesting experience because it's a very sobering topic. It also is a topic that sometimes leaves me and the students kind of gassed at the end of 55 minutes, and so it's an important part of my teaching portfolio. The image that you see here is effectively, and by the way, I'm going to be giving you the roughly 40-minute version of an entire semester, so you're getting just the highlights here. And that's one of the things that I find so interesting about it is it's a rich topic as well, because it involves the forced expulsion of several Native American groups, as the basis, and then it also involves U.S. politics. It also involves the U.S. Court system, and quite a number of other topics that we focus on. And we the main part of the first half of the course will talk about the lead up to and process of removal. And then the students right now in the second half of the course are looking at what life was like in Indian Territory, which eventually became the state of Oklahoma. And we're focusing on that topic right now. So this is the map of essentially the subject of my course. Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking about one Andrew Jackson, and his presidency was, whether you loved him or hated him, his presidency was consequential for all Americans and in particular for Native Americans. And this is a very popular cartoon. This is kind of political satire, 1830s style, but sort of emphasizing the paternalistic rhetoric that Jackson used to sell the removal program. He tried to, in a way, sugarcoat it, talking about the humanitarian benefits of removal to get the legislation passed in Congress, and of course the actual process of removal was anything but humanitarian, and I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. Don't have to read all the text here, but one of the central focuses of the class is the treaty process. You may be familiar with the importance of treaties in Native American history. There's some key court cases that we have to study, and it's the treaties that to this current day are the basis for some of the limited sovereign rights that indigenous groups have in the United States today. And so the Cherokee court cases that I'll try to give you a briefing on will hopefully illuminate that. The treaties, the British colonies, this is going way back into the 17th and 18th centuries. The British colonial governments signed treaties with indigenous groups. It's the focus of the research on my first book with the Muskogee. One of the things that I've noted in my research is that right around the year 1750, there's an important shift. The early treaties focus on things like establishing peace after war, establishing alliances, setting the price for trade goods, those kinds of things. Catching runaway enslaved people, also a part of some of these treaties in the South. And then there's a shift in the 1750s where the main topic of discussion is land. And this is in the context of the 7 years of French and Indian War, and I see the 1750s as kind of the beginning of a real shift in the power dynamics on the continent between Europeans, the British in particular, and the various Native American groups. And then what happens during the American Revolution is that most of the indigenous groups in the soon-to-be independent United States actually side with Britain. You can maybe guess why. Britain had a convergence of interest with indigenous groups who wanted to put down the rebellion. The British wanted to put down the rebellion, and many indigenous groups wanted to stop the spread of settler colonialism. And during the American Revolution, there's a pretty massive influx of Anglo-American settlers into places like Kentucky, into the Ohio country, into western Pennsylvania. And so that was, and so after the war, the U.S. government kind of comes down hard on many of the tribes and historians now call this conquest theory. But if you read the treaties from the mid-1780s, they're pretty harsh, punishments, things like making them essentially pledge allegiance to the United States and no other foreign power, using language that sort of entraps them in a relationship of dependency. So the U.S.'s theory was that, well, they picked the wrong side and lost. And then, as you are aware, we established a constitution in 1787, ratified in 1788, and with that came a kind of shift in U.S. policy. The idea was actually formed by George Washington's first Secretary of War, Henry Knox. Knox came up with this idea of expansion with honor. I think most people in the United States at this time assumed that the United States would expand its borders. They assumed that settlers would be moving west. That was the expectation. The question was, how was that process going to unfold? Was that going to be through brutal, bloody, expensive conquests, or through some other more gentle means? And so Knox, with the assistance of Washington, came up with this idea of expansion with honor, which kind of put the U.S. on a treaty-by-treaty basis with the indigenous groups. And if it seems maybe contradictory, it was a contradictory policy. How do you expand? How do you engage in conquest and yet maintain one's honor? And the fact is, the United States fought a pretty brutal series of battles with the Ohio Indian Confederacy, led by the Shawnees, but joined by a lot of other tribes. And the U.S. Army lost 2 major battles before winning a major battle in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, somewhere south of Toledo, Ohio. Anyway, Washington did establish some precedents that were later reversed during the period of removal. I just wanted to emphasize that for about 30, 40 years, the United States pursued a policy called civilization. And what did that mean? Civilization was an attempt sponsored by the U.S. government to turn indigenous people into property-owning commercial farmers. And in addition to that, to adhere to Anglo-American gender norms. And this was a real conflict between European and indigenous peoples. The Muskogee Creeks, the Cherokees, others. Women did the farming. Women owned the land. Mythically, Indian women are the ones who are attached to the soil by blood and by agriculture. And so, what the United States was trying to do was turn the men into farmers, and they did things like provide tools, farm equipment. They set up a model farm in central Georgia to show Indians how to, grow things like cotton and European staple crops like wheat. And they sent missionaries. We start to see the beginnings of missionary boarding schools, and this was a public-private venture funded by the American Board of Foreign Missions, and also sponsored by the U.S. government through tax dollars. And so this was the policy for many years, was to civilize Indians with the expectation that they would give up their tribal domains. And remember, too, indigenous people hold land in common. It was true then, and it's still true in a lot of places today. You can build a house on land, you can set up a farm on land, you can establish an auto body repair shop on a parcel of land, but you don't own it outright, fee simple, the way that we would a home or a business in the United States. It's a collective approach to land use and ownership that still informs the way indigenous people operate to this very day. So this was the big push on the part of the government. I mentioned Andrew Jackson. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that removal was actually conceived by none other than Thomas Jefferson. It's Jefferson who initiates the removal policy. It was voluntary during his presidency as he saw it, but a couple things to note about his presidency. First of all, he established what we call a factory system in around 1803, and the term factory then was just a market, a place where you buy and sell goods. It doesn't mean manufacturing the way it does today. And these were government-owned stores where a government employee would sell trade goods. These could be guns, these could be iron implements, these could be cloth, you name it. Sell those goods to Indians on credit. And the government, because they were funded by the government, was able to sell at either a loss of profit or just a break-even level. They weren't trying to make money, so they would sell goods to Indians, repeatedly, extending credit with the intention to get them trapped into debt. And the idea was that once they're so far in debt, and of course indigenous people didn't really have anything to pay back with, the deerskin trade was diminishing at that time. That had been their main economic link to the first the British colonies and then the early United States. But the supply of white-tailed deer is diminishing in eastern North America, and people can't make a living. Indian people cannot make a living that way. So, what do they have to sell back to to pay off their debts? Land. And so this was an intentional policy on Jefferson's part to get Indians to sell off their land. And you may remember too that Jefferson was president when the Louisiana Purchase happened, and was really the architect of that too. And what happens is that with this expansion of land out west, and the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States, but that availability of land also kind of hatched the idea that, well, maybe there's a way to remove Indians somewhere far beyond Anglo-American settlements. So Jefferson plays a important role in all of this. I've got a couple maps here that I always show my students, and you can kind of see perhaps with this pattern of treaty signings, and this, what the map shows is various Indian land cessions by virtue of a 1795 treaty, all the way into the Treaty of 1809 that by which Indians had to cede land in Ohio. And anyway, what Jefferson's strategy was here was to get Indians to sign away lands roughly on the Mississippi River to kind of encircle them. And this is the land loss that the Ohio Indian Confederacy experienced leading up to 1809, and this is the reason why a man by the name of Tecumseh, you may have heard of him, led an uprising against the U.S. government, and then joining Britain against the United States in the War of 1812. In fact, Tecumseh died in one of the final battles of the War of 1812, final land battles, that is. And so there are some important precedents before the actual removal occurs that I think kind of put into perspective what happens in the 1820s and 30s. So I've got, and I'm going to focus a lot of my, the remainder of my talk here on the Cherokees. They weren't, of course, the only one removed. The other 4 of the so-called 5 civilized tribes were removed, along with upwards of 40, or parts of roughly 40 other tribes that are pushed into Indian territory, many of them deriving from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. But the Cherokees are an interesting case in particular because they form a constitutional government. That's one of the reasons that we focus on them. They have a government similar to the United States. They became literate both in the Cherokee language and in English, and they left more of a paper trail, quite honestly, during this time period. So it's a really rich resource to dive into, and to have students dive into. We have the letters of Cherokee leaders, for example. We have their newspaper editorials, so we can kind of begin to see what people were thinking in the Cherokee Nation. So yeah, the original Cherokee homelands prior to contact with Europeans roughly looked something like this. The Cherokees were concentrated more in the Appalachian mountain range and some of the river valleys, but their hunting territories extended, as you can see, into Kentucky and also all the way into the Piedmont areas of North and South Carolina. So it's a pretty expansive range. Why did the Cherokees need that much land? Well, mostly for hunting and seasonal gathering activities. They were agriculturalists and had been for a couple thousand years before they were removed, but agriculture was always supplemented with the hunting game and gathering the products of the forest, so to speak. So this is the original homelands. You can see how this diminishes over time. Treaty of Holston, 1791, Cherokees, and the Cherokees were among the tribes that sided with Britain during the American Revolution and paid a price. And this is one of the prices that they paid. Their domain is diminished by probably a factor of about half in 1791. And through a series of other treaties by 1838, this is all that remained of the Cherokee domain. So you can see it shrinking, and again, in 1818, the Cherokees signed their final land cession, at least before removal, and at that point, they said no more. We can't shrink anymore and be a viable people. We can't be viable economically or politically. So that's what happens through the 1830s. And I've got a few maps that I show my students. One that, so if you pick up a historic map from the 1830s and look for the state of Georgia, you will also see the Cherokee nation there. And if you drive through North Georgia today, if any of you have done that, there's road markers indicating the territorial boundaries of the old Cherokee nation, if anyone's ever been there. But the Cherokees, another thing that makes them remarkable is that they took the civilization program and they tried to make it work for them. They embraced some of the teachings of the U.S. government officials and the missionaries. They, for example, as I alluded to earlier, they valued literacy. They realized that to get along in the modern world with these Americans, our young people need to know how to read. They need to know how to write. They need know how to do math, those kind of important skills. Some were open to the idea of converting to Christianity. And on a material level, the Cherokees had been trading with the British traders since the 1690s, so they were used to European-style trade goods. They used iron plows. They used iron pots and pans. Copper pots and pans. They used European or American cloth like wool to make clothing. And so, continuing on with the civilization program wasn't a huge leap for a lot of them. But again, importantly, they're not trying, the U.S. wanted them to become just like white people. And what happens is that the Cherokees selectively adapt certain material goods, ideas, and technologies from the Americans to defend their own sovereignty. That was always the goal of Cherokee leadership, was to take the tools essentially of the oppressor and make them work for them. And so that's essentially what they do. A few pictures, if you go to the Cherokee, in 1827, write their own constitution, for example, defining the borders of the Cherokee Nation. They set up that same year a printing press and start producing the Cherokee Phoenix, which is the first Native American newspaper. It was produced in both the Cherokee language and in English. It reached an audience that extended well beyond the Cherokee Nation. It was kind of a part of the PR campaign that the Cherokees used to try to influence the government, the U.S. government, in its own favor. So anyway, if you go to New Echota, the capital today, you'll see some of these buildings. The council house, which was essentially a legislative branch of the Cherokee government. They had a Supreme Court, as very similar to the United States, and that's the Supreme Courthouse as it appears today. Most of the Cherokees at the time lived lives that kind of looked like their white settler neighbors. If you look at the cabins that they're constructing, the tools they're using on their farms, and the like. And so this is from New Echota as well. This is basically what a common, average, everyday Cherokee home would have looked like. I've actually excavated one of these many, many years ago as an archaeologist and found some of the same debris that we would find in a settler cabin, just a few miles away. So kind of interesting there, and they've got it set up so that you can look at again, what an average interior design would look like, including basketry here. You see the gun over the mantle and the mortar and pestle used for pounding corn. Corn's a very important part of the Cherokee diet. Just a few more pictures. I mentioned missionary work. There were roughly a dozen missions set up in the Cherokee Nation, and this is a historic photo of one. The building no longer exists, but you can see that these are basically one-room schoolhouses on the bottom, and then the instructor usually lived on the top floor. And the instructors mostly came from New England, men and women, but they were trained as schoolmasters in New England, usually Massachusetts, which had the best education system at the time in the United States, and they were sent down to North Georgia to teach literacy and religion. These are very intertwined topics in the curriculum back then. A few other things. John Ross was the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation during the removal and all the way through the Civil War. And there's a historic photo of his home as well. And Ross was a fairly wealthy, elite Cherokee man. And it's fallen into disrepair. I believe this photo was taken in the 1890s, but this would have been a really nice place back in the mid-1830s. And you can see, this is a photo of him. We look at the Cherokee leadership. They were painted, they were photographed from time to time, and this is a picture of the elderly John Ross, right around the time of the Civil War, who was the principal chief. And you can see the style of clothing that the Cherokee elite are wearing. These are, fashionable suits for men, 1830s style. This is not indigenous dress. Joseph Van. And by the way, some of these last names remain common in the Cherokee Nation today. They were elite, influential, politically active Cherokees who both led the removal and obviously opposed it. So Ross, Van, Joseph Van's home, you can see a picture of it here. Any planter in Georgia would have killed to have a house like this. Van was extremely wealthy as a planter, and he operated a tavern. And this is another kind of interesting thing about the process of removal and the relationship between the tribes in the United States is that as wagon roads are cut into the Indian domains, there's both a threat because there are more people coming, wagons potentially, people who are squatters going to take land or outlaws, you never know. But it's also an opportunity because people traveling also need to spend the night, they need food, they need to be ferried across the river where there's no bridges. And so, people like Van made a lot of money catering to an American clientele with his tavern, and explains why he had enough cash to build something like this. So another important figure, his name was Major Ridge, also one of the Cherokees who he fought in the American Revolution against the U.S., and interestingly, he was convinced that the military opposition to the United States was not the way to go, and he kind of adapts U.S. manners of clothing. He becomes a planter, and significantly, the Cherokee elite by this time do have enslaved African Americans as part of their workforce. They embrace many facets of the Southern planter lifestyle, one of which, of course, is the institution of slavery. And so that is something about these men that I think speaks to their ambition at the time. And that's Ridge's house. Also very nice by the standard of the day, or frankly, any day. Ridge's son, John, and Elias Boudinot. These are two important figures in the Cherokee Nation. John Ridge was the son of Major Ridge. He, along with Elias Boudinot, and that wasn't his birth name. He took the name of a philanthropist from New Jersey. Long story, but these two men were sent to a school in Cornwall, Connecticut in the 1820s. This was a school that catered to some of the local kids, but they especially catered to Native Americans, and there were even a few Pacific Islanders, people who had come on boats from the Pacific that ended up in Boston, kind of think Moby Dick kind of scenario, and ended up at this school. So it had probably the most diverse student body of any place in the United States, and so Budnat and Ridge ended up in Cornwall and received a liberal education. They were highly literate. Budnat would take his skills and return to the Cherokee Nation as the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, the newspaper. So he was the newspaper man, the editor. And Ridge married a young white woman from Cornwall, Connecticut, named Sarah Northrup. And this marriage was something that was kind of shocking to the local community. This Connecticut town that liked to think of itself as enlightened and liberal turns on this interracial couple, and a mob forms around the home where they're saying their nuptials, so literally during the ceremony, and then they're chased out of town as they jump into a stagecoach and leave. So I think a lot of historians think that Ridge was kind of scarred by this event, that he realized that no matter how quote-unquote civilized he became, that white Americans would never fully accept who he was, and this may explain some of his future actions. These are and there's an example of the print shop where Budnat produced the newspaper. I mentioned before too that the Cherokees were literate. They were literate. There was a select few like Ridge and Budnat who could read and write in English, but many Cherokees learned to read in their own language thanks to a syllabary created by this man named Sequoyah. Sequoyah was not literate in English. He was not literate in any language, and we think he may be the first person to just kind of invent, a syllabary out of thin air. And he took Cherokee. He made up a bunch of characters like this for each syllable in the Cherokee language. So it's a syllable-based syllabary, hence the name. And it's really easy for Cherokee speakers to learn this because it kind of mimics the normal course of their speech. And so this kind of revolutionizes Cherokee country, and literacy spreads rapidly. You can see I've got a couple examples of the newspaper here. They're actually online if you in digital form. If you are curious to read the Cherokee Phoenix, there's several academic libraries around the country that have it published. Another example, there's the syllabary. And I think, even as the Cherokee were becoming quote-unquote civilized, I mean, there's still a lingering perception that Indians are savage and barbarian and, just always on the verge of attacking white settlers. And so what happens to I'll finish here in these last few minutes just talking about the process leading up to removal. The state of Georgia obviously plays an important role in the Cherokee removal, and going back to the colonial period, Georgia's colonial charter on paper extended all the way to the Mississippi River. That was kind of how the Georgians conceived of their land base, and the United States government did not think that was very good. And so in 1802, they strike a bargain with the state of Georgia. We call it the Georgia Compact, and Georgia relinquishes its land claims to the Mississippi, and in exchange, the U.S. government makes a promise to extinguish Indian land titles within the proposed boundaries of Georgia. Didn't set a time frame on that, and that was really what is the problem, is that a decade goes by, 2 decades go by, and the Cherokees are still there. And so from the perspective of white Georgians, the U.S. government's dragging its feet. Even though Jefferson thought about removal, and President James Monroe thought about removal, even President John Quincy Adams thought about removal, but never really thought about doing it coercively. They'd never really thought about removing Indians at the point of a bayonet, the way that eventually happened. So as far as the Georgians are concerned, the Cherokees are a nuisance, and they create a constitution in 1827, and this triggers the Georgia legislature because they realize we have a entity within our state that is proclaiming its sovereignty. The very first article of the Cherokee Constitution delineates the land boundaries of the nation, and this triggers the Georgia legislature to pass a series of laws extending jurisdiction over Cherokee country. And these are something that the students have them dig into, but the laws nullified Cherokee laws and ordinances. They criminalized the Cherokee government, so literally if the Cherokee legislature met, if the Supreme Court met, that was a violation of the law. And then importantly, there's a law indicating that any white resident had to obtain permission from the state of Georgia to live in Cherokee country and swear an oath of loyalty to the state of Georgia. They had to get a license or a pass. And so there's a gold rush in North Georgia in 1829 that also kind of increases the power of the, or I should say that creates an influx of people into North Georgia, creating pressure on the Cherokees to cede their land. And then, of course, Andrew Jackson's elected in 1828, assumes office in 1829, and his very first program, the first piece of legislation that Jackson indicates is, his main priority is an Indian Removal Act of 1830 that permitted, and one thing about this is that really I think the state of Georgia is doing more to force the issue than the U.S. government in some ways. The Indian Removal Act it does a few things. It permits the executive branch to organize removal, so it kind of places that, the president in charge of the process, and then it appropriated something like $500,000, $1830 for removal. The cost of removal was actually closer to $25 million, so, but it was an appropriations bill. What it did not do was permit the U.S. government to use force to remove Indians, and it did not permit the executive to violate any pre-existing treaties that the U.S. had with Indians. So the Removal Act does some things, but it doesn't really explain fully what happened in the 1830s. And then I'll maybe fly over this. There are three important cases, Supreme Court cases, and one of them was, or the two that are really important here. The first is the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. It's a case, it was a murder case, Cherokee on Cherokee murder, and the state of Georgia comes in, arrests the killer, and has him executed. And the Cherokees try to press their cause in the Supreme Court. It wasn't the man's guilt or innocence that was at issue. It was rather that a question of sovereignty. The Cherokees thought that they had the jurisdiction over this case, and that case is thrown back at the Cherokees because Justice John Marshall decided that the Cherokees were a, quote, domestic dependent nation. And if that sounds confusing to you, it is, and it is still a confusing matter of U.S. law to this day, U.S. federal Indian law. But the second case, and Marshall was kind of sympathetic to the Cherokees, and he made it known after their decision that he would hear another case with the proper parties involved. And enter Reverend Samuel Worcester. Students sometimes get a kick out of me saying that here is the face of radicalism in the 1830s, this mild-mannered minister. But Worcester engaged in civil disobedience. He purposefully had himself arrested, under one of the Georgia laws, and he was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor just for not swearing an oath of loyalty or obtaining a license from the Georgia government, to reside in the Cherokee Nation. And his case goes straight to the Supreme Court, and this is where Justice Marshall creates what we sometimes call the doctrine of retained sovereignty. He basically says that the Georgia laws should have no force over the Cherokee Nation, and he also says that the acts of Georgia are repugnant to the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States. And kind of all comes back to the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which indicates that the Constitution and all treaties made by the U.S. government are the supreme law of the land. And so Marshall's decision was ignored by Jackson, and the apocryphal story is that Jackson says, Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And of course, you know, the Supreme Court doesn't enforce its own decisions. That's the executive branch. And so Andrew Jackson, who had and just to kind of go back to his past, you know, this is the man who fought against the Creeks in 1813-14. This is the man who who instituted martial law in New Orleans in 1815. This is the man who invaded Florida in 1817 and executed 2 British officers he found there. And this is the man who was also involved in treaty negotiations in the early 1820s to take land from Indians. So, of course, you know, Jackson is unsympathetic and allows Georgia to, have its say in the matter. And, of course, he's not going to enforce the Worcester decision. And so what happens is that the Cherokees realize that Jackson is not going to enforce the Worcester decision. And so this leads to a kind of bitter factionalism in the Cherokee Nation. One party, the so-called National Party, representing probably 80% of the people, didn't want to move. Absolutely refused up until the last minute. And then there's a minority of mostly elite Cherokees that we call the Treaty Party. And in 1835, they are coerced to sign the Treaty of New Echota. And this is the removal treaty that gave the Cherokees 2 years to remove from the time of its ratification. So May 1838 was the deadline after ratification, and what ensues. And I'm just going to skip over some of the stuff. You can see the removal here. I wanted to go back to some of the way that the removal happened. It was the coldest winter that anyone could ever remember in 1838-39. There's a lot of corruption and graft, people selling the Cherokees provisions at monstrously high rates, people putting rocks in the barrels of corn and beef, to cheat the buyers, and between the cold and all the graft. I think the one thing to bear in mind is that 4,000 out of about 16,000 Cherokees die on the Trail of Tears. So that's 1/4. That doesn't count the people who were probably never born because of the poor nutrition of women on the Trail of Tears, and that doesn't count the people who may have died once they got to Indian Territory and found that there was not much there. And so just the way that the Cherokees remember this, they use terms like Holocaust to describe their people's experience, and it's been memorialized in art. To this day, Cherokee artists still use the Trail of Tears as inspiration for a lot of their paintings. These are just some close-ups, but the harsh winter is always depicted. The Cherokees were rounded up first in eastern Tennessee in stockades. These are literally cattle pens at the point of a gun, sometimes just dragged out of their houses with only what they had on their backs. And that might help explain. So when you put people in close confines together, that leads to things like cholera and other communicable diseases. The exposure was a real problem, and hypothermia. The very old and the very young suffered the most. This is a modern artist, but because so many people died on the Trail of Tears, this is a problem for people who, in Cherokee tradition, you die and you're interred near the bones of your ancestors, and these are people who are interred, along the trail in to them, no man's land, effectively. And so that's memorialized in art, all the missing children, all the missing old people, and you'll see this painting of Cherokee women ghosts, and just the memory of all of the elders who died on the trail. This pencil, or maybe it's charcoal sketch from the 1990s, I think, is called "Lost Baby." So the memory of the number of children who died on the trail. And then I knew that was going to happen. So a lesser athlete would have let that drop to the floor. But this is actually a good time to finish with a more uplifting story, and that is the legend of the Cherokee Rose. The Cherokee Rose, so the legend goes, Cherokee women who had a child die on the Trail of Tears cried, all along the Trail of Tears, and then when they got to Indian Territory or Oklahoma. And so the legend goes that when women cried, their tears would hit the ground and sprout this rose, which is the Cherokee Nation's state flower kind of thing. And so the rose grows as a sign of hope for future generations, that the Cherokees will persist and live on, and which they do. To this day, the Cherokee Nation is at least by the number of people enrolled, the largest indigenous group in the United States, occupying much of eastern Oklahoma, and so their persistence is kind of reflected in this legend that has a kind of a poetic truth to it for the Cherokee people. So there is some uplifting things to think about, but there's a reason why in the Cherokee language this event was known as the trail where they cried, and so and also you listen to interviews with Cherokee descendants, and they talk about this in terms of it being a kind of Holocaust for them. So and this is kind of sometimes how my classes end, with a very somber note, but I think we've got a few minutes for some questions, and hopefully you have some, and hopefully I can answer them. So yeah, okay. Yeah, Rose. No, it's a piece of artwork. Yeah, yeah. Any questions? Yeah, right here. One good book. I think the best introductory book is by Theda Purdue and Michael Green. And it's just called The Cherokee Nation and the Trail of Tears. I use it in one of my classes. Pretty sure it's Penguin Press. But I'm happy to send along any recommendations. Maybe I can send you, Jim, that you can pass along to people who are interested. Anything else? There's a lot I skipped, but yeah. 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 And this is, yeah, right in the midst of the Civil War. And this is something that, I think a lot of my students encounter this for the first time. Like they've heard vaguely, oh, there was removal, it happened, but they didn't know any of the details, about it. And so there's things I'm still discovering. This process, happened to the Muskogee, to the Seminoles, to the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and each one has their own history. And then there's some 40 odd groups removed from the Upper Midwest, and so it's and overall 80,000 people roughly are removed, or I would say forcibly expelled, I think is the better language. So yeah. Yeah, they reestablished a constitutional government in Oklahoma in the 1840s, and then the Civil War. When that happens, all of the 5 civilized tribes signed treaties with the Confederacy. That's, again, they were slave owners. A faction within them. The Indians had a lot of their government annuities tied up in New Orleans banks, Louisiana, part of the Confederacy. They owned bonds in southern businesses, those kinds of things. So they had financial ties, and they sided with the Confederacy. So they lose their first government, and then, or their second one, I guess, and then they reconstitute their governments in the after 1866, and then 1907 is when Oklahoma statehood happens, and their governments are effectively extinguished. So yeah. Yeah, no, and that's a good point. And by Andrew Jackson's day, it's Spanish Florida is the one of the big irritants in the South, at least, because it's a Spanish colony. And there's not a lot of Spaniards there. Their British trading operations are moving into places like Pensacola and supplying arms and ammunition to some of the southern Indian tribes, and then. So that's something that Jackson was always, that was important to him as well, to protect U.S. borders. And he had a lifelong hatred for the British because his brother died during the American Revolution of a disease, and because he was struck by a British officer when he was a teenage boy during the American Revolution. It's kind of a long story, but he, the western, and southern borders were of a real concern for him. From the British and the Spanish especially. So that was a factor in his calculations, we think. Very, very explicit. He's explicit about connecting, his position on Indians to his foreign policy. All right, thanks everybody. Thank you. I appreciate you coming out, and it's a lot of different ways to spend Sunday morning, and I'm glad you came to see me. So thank you.